When he turned his back from shoulder to shoulder, it looked like as wide as the tailgate of a truck.
And just darkness, literal darkness, just came like all over, just all over me except where I was standing.
This thing let out the most blood-curdling, mind-blowing, spine-tingling scream that you've ever heard in your life, and it cut through me like a knife.
And I knew that they were going to take me. I just knew it. And then the next thing I can remember is being levitated.
Well, when I look in there, I see two big eyes staring back at me.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Bump Podcast, a place for the believers of the unexplained, monsters, and paranormal. Join us, and we'll go face to face with what goes bump in the night. Hey there, believers. Do I got a show for you today? I've been waiting for this for so long. When I was first going to do this interview, this session, whatever you want to call it, I got hit with COVID. I got put in the hospital, and I was in the hospital on the day I was supposed to record with this wonderful person. And due to his popularity, there was a little bit of a wait list to get back, and I wanted to wait until I had, the time I could afford to just devote to whatever he wants to talk about, and that's today. I've been waiting for a long time. Today, I'm bringing on Mr. Gary Wayne. You may have heard him on, I don't know, a million other podcasts, but he's on mine today. And I'm blessed to have him. It's a wonderful thing. I can't wait to get into this with him. For those of you who don't know who Gary Wayne is, he is the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Yes, this book is beat up. Every fingerprint shows it's got like a waterproof coating on the front of it, but I beat this book to death. And I haven't even made it through like, I don't know, a 10th. Anyway, Gary Wayne's coming on. He hopefully will be able to explain to us in layman's terms, because if you see this book, it's about 700 pages, what the Genesis 6 conspiracy is, what the agenda is, who is involved, what we can do to ready ourselves. And I have gotten tons of notes already written down here waiting on him. And tons more questions in my head, tons more, notes I've left throughout the book. So I'm gonna bring Mr. Wayne on, see what we can get into, see what answers we can get. We're talking giants, we're talking Nephilim, we're talking, conspiracy theories, secret societies, cults. We're talking angels, the watchers. We're talking, let's see, where possibly, I'm going to see if he has any information on the Eliud. Remember when we talked about the Eliud a few episodes back? I'm going to see what he has on it, because I have not heard it anywhere else. So it'll be interesting. Let's go ahead and get into it. We got a lot of ground to cover, and I don't know how long we got Gary, so I'll shut up and I'll bring him on. All right. Hey, Gary, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for bearing with me while I got through COVID and all that kind of good stuff. I know we had to put things off for a couple of months, but it's well worth it to me. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me to the show, and so happy that you've recovered well from from having COVID. I know it can come in a variety of different levels and things, and it looks like it, it had set you back a step or two for sure. But so glad you're able to overcome that. And yeah, very much looking forward to the conversation today and talking with you and to your audience in terms of some things that I think they're probably very curious on and would like, additional information. And that's kind of what I try and do. I like to connect dots, and I try to give deeper information so that people can sort of better understand whatever they're trying to figure out in sort of this kind of genre that's kind of outside, whether or not it's Christian or other religions. It's kind of out of the norm of the mainstream, and particularly from secular society, it's way out of the mainstream. So, but that's what we're here to do, to hopefully help clarify things as they figure things out in the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, first question, if we can just jump straight into it, your book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, what led you down this path? What got you started in this epic of a book?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I wasn't intending to write this size of a book. And if people aren't familiar with it, it's 800 pages. And I took 350 pages out just to size it down enough to be able to get it published, because I was a unknown author, no platform. So I was high risk and high cost. That's a bad intersection when you're trying to get published. Yeah. So, and no platform. So I had done a lot of work well before I started the book, and I started writing the book in, say, about 1997 or so, 1998. But in about 1980 or 81, that's when I started on the path. And what I did was I took up a challenge to read a book because, being quite young at that time, it was a challenge of courage. If you have enough courage, read this book and see what you think. And I said, well, give me an indication. Well, it's about Antichrist, and it's about the false prophet, and it's written by it's a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by a terrific author and researcher in Christian prophecy named Hal Lindsey. And so I read the book, and it scared the socks off of me. And I had been raised Christian, but I had left the faith, and I had been brainwashed through high school and peer pressure and all the things that we all face in the world. And I had kind of left that kind of behind, and I was into the evolutionary theory and things like that, or particularly maybe aliens and all of that, and still love a lot of that genre and stuff. But now see whether or not Hal is being accurate and wasn't manipulating scripture. And so the only way I could do that was just start digging into the Bible. So you start looking up the verses and the chapters, and you kind of realize that, the passages are quoted accurately, but I don't really have the proper context because I'm just trying to dive into a specific verse. So I thought, well, what I have to do is I have to read the Bible. And I'll be looking, as I read the Bible, I'm going to be looking for all the different prophecy narratives, because it's a very, very large subject. So, and I realized that once I got into reading it, I had to go start again and say, wait a minute, there's way more prophecy lines than I thought. So I started to write them all down, all the verses, put them into the files and things like that, just so I could better understand end time prophecy, because it's a scary subject.
Yes, it is.
And is this the time to do that? You run across 6 in verses 1 through 4, which is the preamble to the flood story that's directly connected, and it's part of the flood story. And I just kind of go, I'm not ready for that. I don't know what the heck this giant thing is, but I want nothing to do with that. But as you keep reading, as you get into the, further on in the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis 14 and 15, so not that far in, you're into these other peoples that are coming up.
Yeah.
And they're not showing up in the table of nations that's recorded in Genesis 10 and Genesis or First Chronicles. And some of the nations that are listed in Genesis 10, like the 9 of the 12 patriarchs of the Canaanites, they don't have a patriarch. Everybody else does, but they don't. And it just sort of going, well, maybe I need to just write these things down, and I'll sort of throw it into my super fringe file, and maybe I'll look at that sort of sometime down the road. So, after documenting and assembling all of the different prophetic narratives and things like that, and I had done some work to assemble some of the Nephilim, which is the Hebrew word for giant, as it shows up in the King James Version Bible 3 times, once in Genesis 6:4 and twice in Numbers 13:33. Giant also shows up. That's a different word after the flood, which is more of the Rephaim and the word Rapha. But I'd done some work, and so I had accumulated all of that, but I hadn't really done anything with it. But I understood by this point that there's a relationship here that needed to be sort of understood with the angelic rebellion and prophecy, because you have demons and angels and things that sort of show up, particularly in the New Testament and end time prophecy. And so I had all of these, and I have 12 or 15 books I'd like to write. I don't know whether I'll actually get them all done or not, but I thought, well, I have to figure out whether or not I can get published. And if I could get published, that would anybody read that story? And would anybody buy it? And would it be, sort of, poo-pooed and, just throw, like you're kind of crazy type of thing? Because even when you talk about end time prophecy, you're going to get into that sort of category. We're just sort of talking degrees of how you're going to be viewed by the mainstream. So I decided I would, because prophecy is so complicated. I mean, it's throughout the whole Bible. Like the whole third of the Bible is prophetic, and there's a significant amount of prehistory that's connected to prophecy. And so I thought I'd write a short book. That was the plan, see whether I can get published. And so I thought I'd write a short story about how possibly these giants that show up in Genesis 6:1-4 are connected to end time prophecy. Because again, we get, as we said, we get the fallen angels, we get these mighty princes and kings, and you get demons, and you get the false prophet, and you get Antichrist, and all of these crazy things that are going on. So can I connect that? And I thought I could based on my research. So I was going to write this book, and just did it very quickly with the first 10 chapters from a biblical sort of perspective in terms of kind of piecing some of it together. And then I thought, well, I'm also a history buff, and I'm also a mythology buff. And so, and prophecy had become my passion, but those used to be my passion. And so I still had a lot of interest, and I understood in the world, they have parallel stories before the flood, and then again after the flood. So prehistory has a similar story, but told from a polytheist lens as opposed to a monotheist lens. And just as you've got end time prophecy that shows up in those religions and cultures all around the world, again with a polytheist biases as opposed to my Christian biases. So understanding how they look at things help you understand and also find the connections. So I understood these connections, and so I decided I'd add in things about like Greek mythology and Sumerian mythology, and I did that, and then I realized, well, I can't really give the proper context unless I explain the religion, because their history and their mythology is all interconnected with their particular polytheist religion. Yes. And you can't sort of separate that. So I thought, okay, well, now I got to read more about these religions. I have to learn all about that. And so I had to read, Rig Vedas. I had to read the Popol Vuh. I had to read sort of on and on and on, all the different books I had to read to give a proper sort of context. And so once I did that, I realized that this was a knowledge cult. And then that led to all mystery schools are attached to the organizational structure and the prehistory. And I had to dig into that. When you dig into that, because they're developing this knowledge that they received from the gods and elsewhere. And so that led me into secret societies. So once I went down the secret society rabbit hole, I was down there to in 2000 placed in so then it became this really, really big book. And, on my way through, I was thinking, I have to just stop this. Nobody's ever going to believe this. This is just nonsense. And I would set it aside because it's like, I find it interesting, but it's crazy. Nobody's going to buy it. And so, but I would hear this sort of calling to come back. And, so just when I thought, I couldn't continue and I wasn't really seeing what I was trying to do with it,
Right.
the clarity would come back. And I would also find at that time new sources and things that I would have to be adding in. So I thought it was done a lot of times. And then information and things would come to me in inexplicable ways that I would have to add in. And I didn't want to do that because I wanted to be done. Because this is the first of many books I want to write, not the only book I wanted to write. And so, but I dig into a little bit of the information because even though I'm stubborn, I do tend to maybe come around a little bit. And then I start saying, okay, yeah, this is important. This fills in so many gaps. And so I would keep adding that. So it was a long sort of process to write the book, and not the book that I intended. So, and in case there's not enough information in this book, I have a sequel coming out that I said I would never write, that I'll put out later this year, because what I learned from the audience, and particularly from the Christian community, which I measure everything again with the Bible, and in a contrary way, just approach the Bible is that I don't believe what somebody says. I have to verify it for myself. So anything outside the Bible, I want to verify that as well. And then I want to see how that measures up as it pertains to the Bible. And if it doesn't match, I may just look at it, well, that's interesting for context, but that's not going to affect my directional sort of view on something.
Right.
So it's got to line up. But you find there's so many things that really line up as long as you understand what that polytheist lens is and see what they're actually saying. They're saying the same thing. They're just throwing in their multiple God religion that's in there. So I've got another book coming out that's not, I promise, won't be as big as this one. Although I'm on chapter 60 right now.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm hoping it's going to be about 70 chapters, but it's going to be more Christian based, as opposed to what I would try to do in this book is sort of attract people from all sort of genres and get them curious to dig deeper in the Bible, Christians and non-Christians alike. And I do a lot of shows that are straight polytheist or secular or alien or you name it. I tend to be able to, because of the knowledge gathered in this research, I can sort of make connections for them in terms of their genre as well. And so this one is going to be, very good for Christians in terms of what they're asking for, that they wanted more information about the giants in the Bible. And there's way more information in there than what people think. How does that connect to prehistory? How does that connect to the angels? And in a way, whether or not of the angels and the forces, both visible and invisible, I'm digging deep into that from a biblical perspective. And hopefully it does what a lot of Christians are looking for, to go to that next level in terms of understanding in the Bible. So it's going to be called Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, as I'm thinking, unless the editor decides differently or the publisher decides differently. And the subtitle probably will be Prehistory, Prophecy, and maybe I might put something in there about giants or angels, but it's basically prehistory and prophecy, because one of the things that need to understand, if you want to understand the full context of prophecy, you have to understand prehistory, because all of the allegory and the context is there. I know that was a rant, but
Hey, that was perfect. That's a perfect way to explain it. I can't wait for the second book. Full disclosure, I haven't made it all the way through the first book. I bought it like 5 years ago, and I was brand new to the whole idea, and I cracked the book open and I got through about 30 pages and I was like, I can't keep up. I was brand new into this. So it was over my head.
Yeah.
But it was so entertaining. I didn't want to stop, but I just couldn't grasp it. Well, cut to now.
And for For people that may want to look at the book it is loaded with information. There isn't filler in there. It just sentence after sentence, right from chapter 1 through chapter 98.
Yeah.
It's going to give you more information, but it's written in a style, because I know, and I'm trying to introduce people sort of slowly, but there's just so much going on that it just sort of keeps building, right?
Yeah.
So you can't speed read it, because, and I should probably put a warning out on the first book, but I didn't as a joke, but don't read it too fast, because you might pop some brain cells. So like you'll get overloaded with information. So each chapter is a mini story.
Absolutely.
And so you can walk away and come back, and as the book unfolds, that information will keep coming up. So if you want to go back and refresh yourself, that you can. So, but it might take 2 or 3 months to read with the speed of sort of understanding. And then I find many people, as what I learned with the book as well, with all the different readings I had to do with it, is that you learn so much more in the second read and in the third read.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people will use the book as almost like a reference book because of how the chapters are set out.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's what it's taken me longer now to read it, is I do like, I love the references, you know, so I'll go in there like, oh, let's check this out. And I'll pull up Google and I'll stop what I'm doing to check this out, you know, and learn more as I go. And plus, when the first time I tried to read it, I don't want to intimidate anybody. I was working full time and going to college full time to get my degree, you know what I mean? And I was trying to read this on top, and this was like its own study for me, because I wanted to learn everything I could. I just didn't have the time to devote to it. That's what I should have said. But it's a fantastic book. I can't wait for the second one to come out. I should be ready for it by the time it gets here. So, all right. So here we are at Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 4. Right. That's where they drop the word, the Nephilim. For those who don't know what the Nephilim are, or who the Watchers were, can you give us a brief history on
Sure.
that? Okay.
Yeah, and it is a big subject, but I'll condense it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it's huge. I hate
I'll
that
give
you asked
people
that.
as best as I can do, which I'm not good at condensing at times. So giant shows up, as I said, 3 times as it shows up in Genesis 6:4 with the word Nephil. And so one of the things I do is I like to take things back to Hebrew and to Greek to get a fuller understanding. So in other translations, that's going to show up as Nephilim, which is the male plural, which is understood as a plural. And what I encourage people to do as a plural, attach the word ones on it. So let's say you get seraphim angels, for example. They were the 6-winged fiery serpent angels, and the singular is seraph, and the plural is seraphim, with the I am plural, male plural. AH would be a female plural. And so you would understand that as that translated out of Hebrew as the 6-winged serpent-faced angels.
Wow.
A dragon, right?
Yes, a dragon.
Angelic dragon. And so it helps you to sort of understand the word, so that when you take the word giant back to Nephil, which is the singular format, and that it says that that word means in Hebrew a tyrant, a bully, or tribe of giants. One has several meanings, and you have to apply the right meaning in the translation and or the context. Right. And in that one, I would use all of those definitions that are provided to understand who the giants are in Genesis 6:4, created before the flood. And that this word giant doesn't mean something taller, just taller. I mean, it means absolutely out of the norms of tall and size. And these were monstrous types of beings. And before the flood, those giants would have been bigger than the ones after the flood, who are named differently. That's the Rephaim that we're talking about, that's used 25 times in the Old Testament. Yeah. And it shows up as a word, Rephaim, twice in Genesis Ep13 which is a post-Diluvian or after the flood war of the Mesopotamian giant kings against the giant nations and kings of the covenant land. That is taking place just after Abraham has moved in from Ur into the land of Canaan. And so there are also many more names for the Rephaim nations after the flood. And I don't talk a lot about the Rephaim in the first book because I didn't want to get people confused, because I realized most of them. The second book, we're going to talk so much about Rephaim, you're going to get, you're going to be seeing that in your sleep, I think, if you read the book. So these are the giants that are created by a group of people called the Sons of God in the preamble to the flood story.
Yeah.
And so it's there as a direct connection to the cause that causes the violence and the leading away of all of the people of the earth at that time, Sethites or Cainites. And particularly the Sethites are going to be corrupted at that time forward. And that these are the giants that are going to usurp the kingships and control and enslave humankind after that point, because they're the offspring of the sons of God. They're a hybrid being, angelic and human, because they're created from the sons of God and human females. Now, in polytheism, demigod is what they're kind of called. They're also known by a lot of other names, whether or not it's the Titans or it's the Anunnaki, and also Watchers as well. But understand that these giant kings will have similar names and titles as their parents, the godfathers, or the celestial mafia, as I would like to call them. And the sons of God are the fallen angels. Okay. And demigod in polytheism, from the polytheist lens, is defined as the offspring of a god and a human female, just as Poseidon, had one wife, had many human wives. One of them in particular is Clymene, and she produced 10 Nephilim kings, 10 Titans, as they're called, as Atlas is called the hero and a Titan, Titan of the earth in this case, as opposed to the Titan of the heaven that the gods are also called. And this is the same story in Greek mythology, with gods procreating with human females to create the same beings. Now, the sons of God in the Bible are thought to be either Sethites in some views. Sometimes they're thought of as angels. And sometimes they're thought of as a term that are the humans after, or in the New Testament, that are called the sons of God. And so I do cover this a little bit, and I have great documents on this that I do for free. If people want to get a hold of me through my website, just ask for the document in terms of a subject area. I'll send you that document. But where I'm getting at here in terms of the sons of God in the New Testament, that is a promise that happens as a prophecy, an extension of Christ's resurrection, that will be adopted as sons of God in the future time, even though we have human fathers. Yes, using bits and pieces out of different verses. It's got nothing to do with what happened before the flood, or that these sons of God are something unique when it's making a designation. We have human fathers and they do not.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the sons of God shows up in the book of Job 1:6, 2:1, and 38 verses 4-7. And these are the angels that are presenting themselves before God's throne in heaven, whom Satan also accompanies. And what's interesting as well is in Job 38, sons of God are there with the morning stars at the time of creation. Humans aren't there at the time of creation. And stars, the host of heaven, sons of God, and angels are used together often, not all four at the same time, but in different combinations, which I'll show you, in the document to know that they're talking about the same thing. They're also not the sons of God, as Israel is called, because they're going to happen much later. And that's an allegory, because they're not a son of God. There's only one true sort of son of God, and then there's these sons of God, and they have different creations, right?
They could have made this
So we
simpler,
need-
couldn't
we
they?
need- Yeah. So these are angels in the short story, and they are watchers, as they're called in Enoch. Now, watchers are 4 different groups that sit around the throne. They are the archangels, like Michael and Gabriel. There's more, but according to the book of Enoch, but that's all that we get biblically, although in the old KJV Apocrypha, you also get Uriel and Raphael of the 7. It's probably the 7 that are talked about in the book of Revelations as the watchers. And then you also have the cherubim. And again, notice that you're getting that I am plural, right? And they're the 4-faced angels.
Yep.
And you also have another group that is described in the book of Ezekiel in chapters 1 and 10, where you have the cherubim that are pulling in the vision God's throne. Have ones that are kind of like the cherubim, but they have a different face and they're in the wheels. And in the book of Enoch, they're called the Ophanim. And Ophan and Gigel are both Hebrew words for wheel. And so when it's referring to a wheel in the Ezekiel passages, that's Gigel. When it's referring to the wheel angels, it's Ophan. And put the I am plural on it. These are the wheel angels, right? The wheel ones, right? And those are the 4 groups of watchers. When I add in the last one, which is the seraphim, who we already talked about, which were the 6-winged, as Isaiah 6 talks about, that work before the altar, who have serpent faces and act as priest-like angels, and actually will take one of those hot stones and purify Isaiah's lips in that vision to take the sin away, so that he can receive the information that he's going to get. And these are responsible for not only the sort of religious aspect, as they're understood being as ministers before the altar of God, or in the altar of God of the fiery stones, but also the governance of the earth. So when you look at what's going on in the book of Enoch, you see that not only are they, as the fallen angels are providing the religion and the illicit knowledge, but also they're governing as watchers. We do get watchers that does show up in the Bible 4 times. Wow. And that is in Daniel 4. When the watcher comes down in a vision from Daniel, that is going to be talking about governance and thrones and who should be in power and who shouldn't be. And that's the Hebrew word Ayer, which is an important word to understand when you're starting to talk about watchers. And Ayer means to be wakeful, because these watchers were always awake before the throne in front of God. And so when we look at the word satyr, which is a devil goat god, right, in the Bible, it shows up twice, and actually a couple more times as devil gods. But in Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 34, that's the word Sair. And Sa is broken down to hairy and Ayer as a watcher. These are degraded watchers after the flood that show up. So they're the seraphim watchers who are degraded, and it's the seraphim watchers who create the first group of giants recorded in Genesis 1 through 4. Now, when you start to take that imagery of these seraphim, dragon or serpent-faced angels, gods as they're known as fallen, we know them as fallen angels in Christianity, but they're known as the gods of the pantheon. You start to understand why there's so much serpentine imagery in, let's say, the Naga gods in India, or the dragon creation gods in China, or gods like Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha and all of the feathered and plumed serpent gods of the Quiché Maya and the Incas. Right. And you've got gods like Enlil and Anki looking like serpent gods, and Tiamat, that's a parent god, that's serpent-like, and the parent gods, Egyptian, and Isis, who are depicted as serpent gods. And in all the cultures around the world, you get a large group of these governing angels, even as in Zeus, and the Olympian gods being depicted in serpentine imageries in their original sort of presentations. And these are fallen seraphim watchers that were the ones who created to create offspring that probably looked just like them.
Wow. Okay. That gives me a couple more questions. Now, if the sons of God, if they were referring to Sethites, that would mean that, you know, strictly just Canaanite women were the ones that were being used to reproduce, right?
Yes.
Now, as the sons of God in the term as fallen angels, is it still just the descendants of Cain that were being that were procreating with these creatures, or?
Well, I think in the beginning, but one has to be open to the idea that as the next few generations unfolded,
Right.
And Noah lived 600 years until the flood, and these are created in the time of Jared and Noah, depending on whether or not you're getting the days of Jared from Enoch or the days of Noah, as it's called about in the Bible. It matches up perfectly, by the way. There is a lot of period of time, right? And as Noah shows up in the Bible, he shows up in the last chapter, the last verse in chapter 5, where he shows up, and so do his 3 sons. And then you get the next 4 chapters of the flood, and then you get his genealogy again and his commission, right? So he bookends around this. And so he's intimately connected. And that's why you have that reference for end time prophecy as in the days of Noah, which is sort of the overarching, one of the 3 overarching signs to the specific events that are talked about in Jesus's orations in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and 21. So that's why one of the reasons why it's important to understand, because he lived 350 years after the flood as well. And those are the same words that Jesus uses, the days of Noah.
Right.
And,
yes.
and one's written down as English translated, or written down in Greek translated into English, and the other one Hebrew recorded and translated into English. And it's the exact same words, because it ought to be, because he's the Word of God. So these giants that are procreating, they're going to corrupt the Sethian line after their creation, along with the mystical religion, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's part of the overall organizational structure. And by the time of Noah, and by the time as you hear, is going to be probably the last of the ones loyal to God and believing in God, not corrupted spiritually or physically, is the one chosen to cross the flood, which is why we have that genealogy before the flood, then we get the genealogy afterwards, and then we get Jesus's genealogy. So we get that complete genealogy throughout the Bible, so that we can understand the purity of that bloodline.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So what's going on in a nutshell, and this is elementary terms because I'm nowhere near your level, but from my understanding, just the watchers, or the fallen angels, were cast down. They're on earth. They see these Canaanite women. They breed with them, take them as their wives, some say, and they have the Nephilim. They also get a hold of the Sethites after about 7 generations or something like that. They corrupt that bloodline, and that's their whole agenda.
They'll be corrupting them immediately. Yep.
Yeah. Is that the whole plan?
What's the context, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, it is. It is, but it is not the source of the whole plan.
Okay.
It's sort of the weapon, one of the weapons of the plan.
Okay.
So if we want to understand our history, why we're created, why all of this is playing out, and it plays out through free choice, and God is greater than free choice, so he knows everything is alpha omega. He knows how it's going to happen. You have an angelic rebellion that is a context that you have to understand, that is key to everything of who we are, why we were created, and what our destiny is if we choose it. And so when you have the creation of Adam in Genesis 2, this is the resolution plan that God has decided to go forward with. That is the resolution to the angelic rebellion. So that we will be raised up in the physical world with very little knowledge of God, unlike angels who are in the world, have intimate knowledge of God yet still rebelled. And we're going to be forced to choose our way through this world that's corrupted by the fallen angels, that Satan is still the prince of the world and is governed by the council of gods in Psalm 82, as numbered by the 70 nations, both before and after the flood, as the number of the sons of Adam, although they're not fully listed in the Bible, are counted at 70 in Deuteronomy 32, or the 70 sons of Israel in Egypt, or the 70 patriarchs in the Table of Nations that we talked about earlier. And so these 70 nations have representatives of a fallen angel that sits in the council of God that Satan sits over, because he has a council like God. It's a different word for congregation than it is in Isaiah 14, where he wants to become like God and raise his throne into heaven to be like God, into that congregation. It's a counterfeit congregation. That's part of the context, is that we're the resolution to this rebellion. And so that's why Satan goes on his revenge. Fallen angels do. And the first revenge is the fall of Adam and Eve in Eden. The second revenge is the creation of the demigods to enslave them and lead them into complete destruction, so that we can't be raised up in the future time to be like angels, even though we have human fathers, so we can be raised up like sons of God, and have chosen that with very little knowledge, all on faith, and that we will actually judge those fallen angels in the future time for their crimes against creation and humanity in creating these demigods and all the horrible things, both the fallen angels and their demigod spurious offspring, the terrible ones as they're called later on in the Old Testament, like in Isaiah 14, or Isaiah chapter 14, as in Ezekiel 31, as in Ezekiel 32. I won't go through all of the chapters. These are the terrible ones for the terrible things that they did to humankind, right? All throughout their history, and they're there to ensure we don't reach our destiny. And so you get all of these revenges that are going to happen throughout the Bible recorded, right? Have the flood. Actually, they've corrupted the whole world. God's going to start again, so he's going to wipe out everybody but 8. Unfortunately, the giants and the fallen angels, not all of them, or not all of the fallen angels, went to the abyss for their crimes. So there were still ones that are out afterwards. So it doesn't matter whether or not Nephilim survived the flood or they're recreated after the flood. And I document both in my book. I lean from a personal perspective on second creation of giants because it fits better. Yeah. And they were leading us astray right from the beginning, because they're the first ones there, and they're the people that the people of Babel are going to meet up with thereafter and then intermarry with. And they're going to impose their mysticism and their organizational structure, their 4-class system, to enslave humankind, where the humans are all the slaves and the working class, and they control all of the upper classes, including of the religion. And in Babel's, you have Israel being, and all of the things that the nations in the time of the conquest tried to do to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. You have Satan trying to have Jesus murdered as a baby. Yes. You have the crucifixion of Jesus. That's the thing, greater than the gods. He's greater than the pantheon. He's greater than the fallen angels because he's Alpha Omega. And had the fallen angels understood that there was going to be a resurrection. They wouldn't have had Jesus crucified,
Right.
as the book of Corinthians talks about. So they don't know everything. They're telling their followers that they do, and God is just another angel just like them.
Mm.
But that's the two sort of different belief systems we have on earth. And if people think secular is a third one, no, it's a puppet string of the polytheists. So you have to understand what's behind the curtain in terms of science. As I said, it was a knowledge religion, and they created the 7 sacred sciences that we call the 7 liberal arts today. And that's what merged in the time of the flood, before the flood, with the knowledge from heaven, the illicit knowledge, or the gods that providing the knowledge in polytheism. And this is the knowledge that is going to help parade the antediluvian epoch into destruction, and the same knowledge that we're now starting to catch up to. So it'll be like the days of Noah, with all of the technology that we're having access to today. So when we look at those 7 sacred sciences, that's what is used by a fellow by the name of Cain, who, according to polytheism, learned this knowledge in Eden from Adam, or Adam learned it in Eden, and he's running this large, massive garden. It's got 4 huge rivers flowing through it,
Right.
including the Euphrates and the Nile River. This is not small. He's raising herds. He's raising crops. He's raising orchards. As you take that language back to the Hebrew, you get all of that meaning. And so he would have had to have been provided significant knowledge to run it by himself. And then he's added a partner of the name of Eve that comes from him. And so this knowledge is passed on to Cain and to Abel. Abel's obviously murdered, and then to Seth. Seth's going to use the knowledge to honor God, but Cain's way, who he passes it on to Enoch. Enoch is the one who separates it into the 7 sciences, and it's designed to lead people away from God. It's designed to degrade God. It's designed not to give credit to God for anything. And the 4th thing it's designed to do is to honor their pantheon of gods, all possible buildings, words, language. The whole system is Satan's system, and the pantheon, and that's who they're going to honor. And when you roll that forward to 1662 in the West, you get a formation of the Royal Society that is formed by Rosicrucians and Freemasons, that is going to be the modern wedge and the first outside the Roman Church for education for an organization. And the sciences that all science and education still pays homage to do in what's called the Invisible College or the Royal Society. It's known by both. Invisible goes back to Rosicrucian. And if you don't know the secret societies, you wouldn't know that they take their patriarchs back to Enoch, son of Cain, and there's 2 Enochs, Enoch, son of Jared of the Seth line, and Enoch, son of Cain, and a lot of people don't realize that, and they're getting conflated throughout history because both had an important effect to the Diluvian world, just as Tubal-Cain, Nama, Jubal, and Jubal, and Lamech, and there's 2 Lamechs as well, are all great patriarchs in the secret societies because they take their creation back to the mystery schools that were used to develop this knowledge. And mystery schools were an extension out of the mystical religion that comes about because of the 7 sacred sciences that Enoch develops that merges with the fallen angels, and they're going to create a mystical religion that is going to sort of beget all those other things I began with. And this is the same mystical religion, Enochian mysticism, that crosses the flood, according to Masonic records, the Royal Masonic records, and that's the ancient knowledge that Nimrod is going to have brought to him by a fellow named Hermes, as their records show, and they have parallel accounts of this. And they use the Bible in a lot of access in a lot of cases, which is why they use the King James Version Bible at least, and they probably use other ones now, but to swear their oaths on, right? And for the initiates, right? And they're told what to study in the Bible. But at the time of Nimrod, so I don't digress too much, Hermes finds 36,525 books under the Great Pyramid, stacked in 9 vaults under the Great Pyramid. And he finds that because he finds one of the 2 pillars. One is designed to survive the destruction by fire, and one is designed to survive a flood, because they don't know what the apocalypse is going to be. They just know they're going to be wiped out, and they're going to save this knowledge. And the directions Hermes finds after he finds this knowledge takes it back to Babel. And that's when we all of a sudden have this mystical religion that's imposed on the Noahites after the flood,
Yes.
right? About 100 years after the flood, and they start worshiping Pantheon. And some of this knowledge is used to build the city, to build Babel Tower. And we're given a hint of how powerful this knowledge is in the Bible, where it says working as one people with one tongue, one language. There's nothing that they now will try to do that will be prevented from them to doing. So God, confuses the languages. And so we see the evidence today in the education and in science that they're doing the same things with the 7 sacred sciences. It's designed to lead people away from God. It's designed to not give God credit for anything. It's designed to degrade God, and it's designed to honor the gods. And all of the our polytheist buildings, all the names that are picked in, all the different names that are used throughout science, all come from the pantheon of gods and their offsprings, serious giants. And it just inundates it with their imagery, their language, and the knowledge that they're developing so that they can eventually bring about a rebellion in the end time. It's all part of the larger agenda.
Wow, that's perfect. You blew my mind. And I've read it. I knew it was coming. I knew what you were going to say, but just the way you can sum it up. I thank you so much for doing this. Okay. So this brings us up. You got us up to modern times. Okay. I guess we can talk about it. Freemasons. They're part of this secret society, right? That are trying to push and further the Nephilim agenda.
Yeah, they're low on the hierarchy.
Okay, who would be higher?
Okay. So let's look at Freemasons, and they have 2 organizational structures. One is the more modern version that was created in the United States called the Scottish Rite. That has 33 degrees. System is 3 degrees. They've just split it up in a prime number 11 ways. 11 times 3 is 33, right? That's first level adept. Second level adept is 5th degree in terms of sort of a position where you would oversee many lodges. At the core of the adept level are the Illuminati. So they'll be higher than a degree. Okay, so Freemasons. And then below the Freemasons, you might have all of these other initiatory organizations that they would have their members part of, just to sort of control, to help implement their sort of overall agenda and sort of keep that sort of veneer out there that they're this good society doing good things for communities and things. So whether it's the Lions Club or the Elks Club, or within the church, you've got the Knights of Columbus and things like that. So they're everywhere with these initiatory organizations. If they swear oaths in their initiatory organization, they are a secret society of polytheism. You just need to know that up front. And I'm not saying, people are allowed to believe whatever they want to believe and do what they want to do, but just understand you're joining. You may not know the secrets because you're not an adept, but you're part of a polytheist organization. And so each of these organizations will have an agenda and a specific role to play. So like the Freemasons, for example, would be in charge of politics and the army. So when you look, let's say even back in American history, they're heavily involved in the writing of the Constitution and controlling with free members like George Washington. I won't go through the whole list of founding fathers, but you can see that sort of sort of representation. And they do that throughout the world. And they expanded their lodge network through the English Empire around the world, so that they could extend this sort of influence. And so the Illuminati, their role is to destroy Christianity and to work on world government. Now, above the Illuminati is the Rosicrucians. And this is a very important organization because it's an intersection organization, as I would call it. So as you rise up through the different levels from Freemasonry and then the Illuminati, the most talented and the ones who they want to move up and will be permitted to intermarry in the royal bloodlines that we'll get to next when you want to understand secret societies, would move up to the lower level of the Rosicrucians. So the bottom half is those ones that are rising up. The top half are part of the Masonic bloodlines, the royal bloodlines of royal masonry that goes back to before the flood, crossed the flood, and was dominated by the royal bloodlines and dynasties throughout history. And so they would populate their people in the Rosicrucians at the top level. Above, and the Rosicrucians, what they're there to do is they're there to keep the history alive. They're there to keep the genealogy alive. They're there to keep the religion alive that we would know as Gnosticism, which produced Theosophy, which produced New Age, but is part of polytheism all around the world because they believe that all of those gods and each of those pantheons are just different vernacular names for the same gods. And I think they're correct on that. And so they focus on things like global Gnosticism because they want to bring that universal religion back, the new Babylon, as they like to call it. And as it was written into the statutes of the Constitution of the Knights Templar, that they were created to create the new Babylon within the Roman Church, and that after the fall of the Templars, you get these other organizations that I'm talking about, including the Jesuits, who are created as the new Templars with Ignatius of Loyola, sponsored by a fellow by the name of Borgia, who is the bloodline of the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, and is head of the, which is royal order that's sponsored by the King of Spain, who was created in 1307, the same year the Templars are destroyed to keep the Spanish wealth within the hands and not into the Pope's hands, right? And so Borgia, he's going to sponsor them, ensure that they get their papal bull in about 1540, and by 1570 he becomes the third Grand Master of the and would put them not in the tree trunk because they would report into the original Rosicrucians who sponsored them. Now, the original Rosicrucians are higher than what they are now. They were the adept level of the Knights Templar, the royal ones, the royal monarchs. So they'd be equivalent 33 invisible ones that were trying to negotiate with the Pope in 1317 to reestablish the Templars within the church. But the church said, the only way we're going to do that is we have complete control. It was going to be not what they wanted. So they went underground and they created the Rosicrucian Society.
Oh my goodness. All right,
And
hold on. Let me stop you just for 1 second.
that explains the history. That will explain the history of the Council of 33 that's above the Committee of 300, where that 33. So there's a couple of groups in between from the original Rosicrucians after the fall of the Templars. You had a question?
Yeah. Well, what I need to do is switch this internet back over real quick. I shouldn't drop you. It'll just transfer because for whatever reason, it started dragging real bad for a second there. Let me just switch it over. I hope we're not going to be, I hope it's not the government. Okay. How's this? Is this working?
Yeah, it's fine on my end.
Okay. It was telling me about my bandwidth was low, and I didn't want to interrupt what you were doing. You were on a roll. It lagged just a little bit there, and I didn't want anybody to miss it. So.
Yep. No worries.
Okay.
So can I start again, or?
Yes, sir. I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's okay. So once we understand that there's hierarchies that are pure blood orders above the Rosicrucians, you're going to have another couple of terms you need to understand that you may or may not be aware of. One would be the black nobility.
Okay.
And the larger black nobility. The black nobility is most famous for the Pope bloodlines within the church, because again, all the upper end of the religions and society is dominated by the descendants of the giants. Understand, they track that, and that's why there's several Borgias as popes as example.
Yes, sir.
Lines back to Julius Caesar and to the royal families of Rome that were created from the gods of Rome in their pantheon. It's the same story. You know, it begins with sort of Romulus and Remus, and they're the offspring of the gods, and you get that royal bloodline further down. So the Jesuits would report into the black nobility, also known as Rex Deus, that I cover also in the book. Which means the kings of God, because they believe they have the divine right to rule from their pantheon of gods, right? Just as King James said he had the divine right to rule. That's the divine right to rule after the flood that came from Mount Hermon and the Baalim, and also the same divine right to rule that the original Nephilim would have believed that they had, because it's all the same sort of belief system. And so the Jesuits would report into probably the Committee of 300, possibly the top end of the Rosicrucians. So as we're going up this tree trunk, and we're at the Rosicrucians, and the Committee of 300 is 300 of the bloodline families of Europe that are above the Rosicrucians, you have all of these intersecting branches that come in. Probably not good to try and understand the hierarchy through pyramids, because you have way too many pyramids and it's way too complicated. Understand the trunk organizations and all of these trees going into the space that they would encompass on that trunk. And that as you go further out into the branch, you get lower orders within that. So let's say you have the Jesuits, which would report in, they would be at the top right by the branch. And some people even put them in the trunk, but I can't quite square that in terms of the general hierarchy. And then below that, you would have all the other organizations within the Catholic Church, whether or not it might be Opus Dei, which was created as what they call Christian Masonry in the 1930s. You would have in there, which were the creators of the Knights Templar. So it's just sort of reestablishing that sort of hierarchy. You have, the very low levels, like, the Knights of Columbus, for example, within the church, right? So, but they report back in, just as you would have the Bilderbergers, which at the top half of that organization is all royals that would go back into the Committee of 300, or maybe the Council of 33, which is the next one above. But they bring in once a year all the new bloods, so to speak, all the new money. Well, so whether or not it's Bill Clinton or Bill Gates or all of these people that you see go into this meeting, they get their marching orders once a year to bring about the global agenda.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're doing that so that their offspring can intermarry into these bloodlines and obtain a higher position in the next generations. The Club of Rome would be similarly attached in at that level as well. That was created in the late 1960s to bring about a world government that has 10 groups of nations or trading blocks or spheres of influence, which is the same number in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17 for the 10 king empire of the end time.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're focused on. So above the Rosicrucians, as I said, is the 300 families, right? And then you have the Council of 33, which is, again, going up the hierarchy of Royal Masonic, Nephilim, Rephaim families. That are above that. And then you have the 13 families. Now, this usually kind of blows people away. That's just the Western bloodline and organization. So you can imagine that you have all of these different bloodlines around the world who have secret societies, just like the Chinese are famous for their secret societies, because they have a similar type of system. In fact, we're considered by, very famous secret society people like the Rockefellers past, would consider their various organizations, and I won't go through the litany of organizations in China, but they have lots.
Yeah.
And that their Chinese dynasty, which is the Shah dynasty, where the Li family comes from, and the Shi name comes from the western side of the Li dynasty. They're created by the dragon creator gods. These are the sons of heaven, are the original Nephilim. These are dragon kings, because they look just like their offspring, just like Akhenaten. If you take a look at him on a Google, you'll see a serpentine face, and that's been line nature for over 1,000 years since the flood, depending on which chronology that you're wanting to utilize. So you have different bloodlines all around the world you have to consider, and that's important to understand when we're trying to understand end time prophecy and what President Xi is doing, who's a bloodline from the Shah dynasty, ZI from ZIA. It's a short form of that name and of the Li dynasty. And he's going to reestablish his ancient empire, just as you have Putin, who is trying to do the same thing for his group of nations, his sphere of influence that goes back to the Kiev dynasties, which is why he wants the Ukraine, and the Putyanin, which were the original bloodlines of the Uruk, of the Tartars, the Cossacks, of the Tartarians, of the Scythians that developed Russia and the Ukraine, and he's trying to recreate that bloodline dynasty. And he's not full pure blood. His name shows up out of nowhere in the 1850s, and that's typically what they did in the Ukraine, where his grandfather was born. And there's no record of a Putin name before that, but there's a Putyanin name, which is the bloodline, which originally established the Moscow Tsar Center, where the Romanovs took over after the 1600s. So just so if people are wondering where the Romanovs kind of fit in. And so what they would do is, if there was somebody born outside of the marriage and was an illegitimate son, they would get only part of the name. And that's where Putin comes from Putyanin. So it's important to understand bloodlines, and there's bloodlines all around the world that are going to form these 10 groups of nations for the end time. That's why it's important to understand prehistory. And it's going to be like the New Atlantis that we talked about earlier, which is a great analogy for Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4, because of the, Poseidon going to a human female and creating 10 Nephilim kings. According to Plato and so that was considered the helm of world government that was trying to take over the whole world before the flood through war, and was the bastion of culture and religion, where all the knowledge and technology was being developed. And when you roll that forward to Francis Bacon, who was a Rosicrucian, and he is the inspirational founder for that Rosicrucian society that we were talking about in terms of the sciences, and his picture hangs in the entrance even to this day as you walk into it. He wrote a book called, you guessed it, The New Atlantis, which imagines a universal religion working in perfect harmony with science in the end time.
Imagine that.
Religion that created the sciences, of course.
Yeah. So, Gary, when you watch the news, is it just like not a shocker at all to you that this stuff is going on? You're like, oh, yep, that has to happen. This has to happen.
It partly yes and partly no, because you expect things and you kind of look at, okay, I think this is how it might sort of shape up down the road. But some of the things that happen to start bringing those things about, they kind of say, well, no, I didn't quite imagine that was going to be part of that sequence.
Yeah.
But you can see it. And you know, and I talk about those 10 groups of nations in the book, and when I get into that sort of prophetic aspect of chapter 4, so that people have an understanding for what I'm going to talk about in the end.
Awesome.
In the last half of the book, in terms of what the secret societies are and these royal bloodlines are trying to do to bring about the end time.
I think we froze up again. Okay.
Yeah.
Mine keeps wanting to freeze for like 2 seconds at a time. It's annoying, but
Yeah, no, you're not freezing on my end.
good deal. Good deal. Hopefully, it won't affect anything. I wanted to bring somebody up, which I hate to do that. I had a past guest on my show, very, very famous man, Scott Walter. I don't know if
I've heard the name.
you know, it was an old show on the Discovery Channel or History Channel called America Unearthed.
Right, that's where I know the name. Yes, I
Yes.
actually have one of his books.
Yes.
Well, Scott Walter come on the show, and I wanted to talk about maybe giants in America. I'm real big into giants.
Yep.
I had this old stone head I wanted him to take a look at on the show and break it down for me. But the show kind of went in a different direction, and I got so much hate mail from it. It was like it got hairy, because Scott Walter said that he has he was a Freemason, or he is a Freemason.
Yep.
Pretty high level.
Yep.
Pretty popular guy.
Mhm.
And he said because of his position and his relative fame, he was approached by alphabet agency that wanted his help to push the alien agenda, and that he was in contact with these people came and stayed with him at his house for a couple of days and wanted him to explain, what the aliens wanted, why they're here. He got kind of political. He got really political for a minute. But it was just, it caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to handle that interview when that happened. Are aliens tied into the Nephilim bloodline and the secret societies? Are aliens not what we think they are? They're not just like little, green men from outer space. Are they demonic? Are they part of this corruption?
Yeah, and we need to, as particularly as Christians and non-Christians alike, we need to understand this whole alien phenomena.
Yes.
And I think the and the History Channel has a show on ancient aliens, and I think they do marvelous work. They obviously work through a biases that these are all aliens and they weren't angels or gods in the past. But other than the level of the powers of the beings, they're telling the same story, but just from an ancient alien creation of guys who were Freemasons, and you look at the influence Sitchin had, and he was a Freemason and a Gnostic. So understand that they're giving you parts of the information, and there's some truths in there, but they're not there to give you the whole truth, the clarity of it. So we need to understand that there is this phenomena that goes back into prehistory with the aliens, whether or not you want to call them aliens or you want to call them angels. Within that, and that's where we need to sort of understand it. And so when we look at what aliens can be, angels, they can take any form that they want. They can take a body, and we know they can take a body because they show up as men that aren't recognized as men in the Bible, and then men that are recognized as angels in other different sort of forms that we see in the Bible. So, and in the pantheon, you have gods and goddesses, so they can take any gender that they choose as well.
Yes.
And that's done through something called the Oiketerian effect. I won't spend a lot of time because I'll get too far down this rabbit hole, but it means a dwelling place for the spirit. And that's the same word that's used for house in heaven in 2 Corinthians 5 and in Jude 1:6, habitation that the angels left before the flood when they created their crimes. And that dwelling place for the spirit. It's a dwelling place for the spirit. So you need a dwelling place for the spirit in this physical world if you want to interact in the physical world. Just as you need a dwelling place in heaven for that spirit to interact in the spirit world.
Okay.
And right, so so the soul and the body is the oiketerion, and it's the spirit that comes from God that is the other aspect that merges with the soul and the body, so that they can interact in the world. You'll be affected by the world just as the fallen angels were, right?
Right.
We need to understand that they can take any form that they want, sort of from that concept. And so they can take the form of any type of alien that they want. So typically in the alien mythos, you get the word Anunnaki and Watcher show up,
Oh yeah.
which they're also called in Sumerian history for the gods. And the Anunnaki are those ones that, you know, have wings and a man's head, or wings and an eagle face, which is typically thought to be part of the cherubim and the eagle of those four faces at a time when they represented themselves on earth as fallen angels, as fallen cherubim, because it's an order of angels, right? It's a grouping. And so they're just sort of bringing those aliens down to a level in the alien mythos to be, you know, highly advanced aliens, but not gods, right? And technically fallen angels are aliens because they're alien to this world and they're from another dimension. The aboriginals, right? So you can classify them as, it's just a matter of how you want to interpret that. I don't think they're demons though. And for this case, unless they've got a technology where they can possess a clone body or something like that, that a demon would require, because a demon is the bodiless spirit of a giant.
Right.
It's the counterfeit spirit that's not permitted to go to sleep, and it's not permitted to go into heaven, and it has to wander. Unless it's one of the terrible ones that ends up going to the abyss, that are in the cells alongside who are slain for doing terrible things while they're on the earth. That's typically that cut the head off as fast as you can type of death. And that was the worst death that you could have as a Rapayu, which is the Ugaritic Semitic word that Rephaim comes from, that were created by the Baalim and Baal that are recorded in the Ugaritic text. And that was the worst death that they could have, right? Because it wouldn't allow them to go where they wanted to go, right, in the underworld and afterwards, or didn't want to go to prison. And so these are the ones that wander, and these are the ones that Jesus, not symbiotic, it's not a symbiotic relationship, perhaps unless you're an adept level shaman or something that you're going to invite it in, but it's still going to take control over you, right? But it will add power. But with somebody who is fighting it, as in a Christian or Judaic possession, it's not symbiotic. Right. Right. So doesn't seem to me that they're going to sort of show up that sort of way and or in other aliens, but it's a possibility. Typically, when I look at the lower levels of the organizational structure of the alien mythos, you get things like little people, like the gray aliens. You get the lizard people, and maybe different groups of the lizard people, and then you start adding in all of these other different forms. If we look at polytheism in terms of what the gods did both before and after the flood, they created the Chimera one that everybody's sort of caught up on, which is, you know, has multiple beings that are DNA manipulated in to create these Chimera type of beings. Knowledge that we're just catching up that was there before the flood. They created all sorts of different beings, and you know, like Pegasus and centaurs and on and on and on and on. We won't go, but just give you an idea that they created a lot of different types of creatures. And so there's one group that's at the bottom that I would say of the hierarchical order, or close to the bottom, would be the creations as offspring of the gods, which are like the giants, right?
Uh-huh.
And so the giants are considered higher in the hierarchical order as the demons than the elementals. And I talk about 3 groups of elementals in the book, and I'll talk about the 4th. I'll talk about the 4th first. Order of the aliens, and it is the salamanders, as it's called, of the elementals, and they're larger than the little people. So when you hear about these larger reptilian type of beings, these are likely the salamanders. I don't know whether they're the same as the Nakash, the serpent in Eden that was a walking, talking, intelligent human being, but it could be a different kind of, could be the same, or it could be a different kind of being. And in that sort of scenario, to have Nakash survive, it would have had to have been saved by some of the fallen angels in the earth, off the earth, however they did it, right?
Yeah.
So then you have 3 groups of little people that show up all throughout polytheist history. You've got nymphs and fairies and elves and hobbits, and everybody knows all about it. What they don't know is it's a common legacy all around the world on all continents, just as the flood story is. Religion was, just as pyramids are on all continents around the world, except for Antarctica, but we don't know what's below the ice, so we'll leave that one sort of unanswered until now. But there are 3 groups of them. One is the good-looking ones, another one is the mischievous ones like the leprechauns, and another one is the ugly ones, and they have all sorts of different sub ones in there. There's many groups within that 3 group, but there is one that sort of connects it into the alien mythos in a way that I think is really relevant. In the ugly ones, you have things like hobbits, and like in Lord of the Rings, you also have dwarves, which live in the earth and make weapons for the demigods. Big role. There's also another one called the Gnomes, which looked after knowledge and genealogies and technology for the demigods.
Yeah.
In the hierarchical order. And they had flying machines that would come through portals.
What?
Fairy mounds, as they're called. Fairy dolmens. You can Google a dolmen, D-O-L-M-E-N, and it's like a mini Stonehenge. They're all over the world, these portals. But in the fairy mythos, they come through the fairy mounds, or the Shays, S-I-D-H-E, and they're called the Shay people, which are different than the ugly dark elves, and they're typically allegorized as the Tuatha De Danann, as we would understand them, as the giants, both before and after the flood. And in Lord of the Rings, they're the taller white ones with blonde hair, red hair, hazel eyes, and blue eyes, that they're showing up in that sort of organizational or hierarchy of this greater Nephilim concept, for lack of a better word, but in the elemental sort of group. So the gnomes are described as having flying machines that come through these portals, and their descriptions, and I give 2 descriptions in my book, they come through and they kidnap people for a fortnight, as they do in Scotland, longer in other places, and they do experiments on them. They've done this on human beings, and they do this throughout history, but their description is identical to a gray alien. Of course. And if you didn't know, I was describing a fairy abduction, you would swear it was a gray alien abduction going on. So when you start to sort of understand the concept of the polytheist understanding and the beings that they would have created illegally as all violations against the laws of creation, both before and after the flood, as my understanding it is that they could be presenting as aliens all of these different beings. And another concept in the alien mythos is that they don't necessarily stories like you see in Star Wars and stuff, but typically though, most of the encounters seem to have spaceships or flying saucers or UFOs, whatever you want to call them, showing up as they come through portals.
Wow.
And I think they're coming from another dimension versus from a planet beyond our solar system.
Yes.
Well, there it is.
aliens or gnomes.
Well, one group of the gnomes.
Yeah,
But certainly,
yeah.
one group of the aliens, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there'll be many, and we're going to be shown many of these different groups
I believe that.
as part of the deception, so that they can lead us into this end time war, Armageddon, to fight against the evil God of the Bible and win freedom, just as the angels were trying to do, led by Lucifer, to have a world on their own, to be away from God and not have God's oversight.
Wow. Well, Gary, I have one more question, and I asked you this. I mentioned it before we started recording, so I would like to just hit on this real quick, and then, I won't take up any more of your time. I'll have you tell me where we can find your book and your website and everything. But my last question for you, it pertains to another past guest that I had on. I mentioned this to you real quick before we recorded. I had a guest that said that she had telepathic communications with a Bigfoot creature, which we haven't even talked about Bigfoot. I guess that's for another day. But she said that, that at first it was just, communication, and then they started some gifting stuff, and it eventually led to where this creature was telling her that he was an Eliud, and said that he was a son of a Nephilim, and that she was, she needed to read certain books to gain knowledge about a feminine Holy Spirit or something to that effect. Are you familiar with
that's interesting concept. So
yeah, are you familiar with it?
Somewhat, I would say. This Eliud term, from a apocryphal Christian perspective,
Yes.
surfaces, as I recall, in the book of Jubilees, where it lists the Nephilim, the Naphadim, and the Eliud as being types of giants, types of Nephilim.
Okay.
Now, you could interpret that as being types of Nephilim as not being serpent look-like, to, let's say, like a lion, as in the lion men of Moab or Gad, that would come from like Nergal, that's listed in the Avim, one of the Rephaim races after the flood worshipped in the east. Or it could be, like a Sekhmet god, or there's lots of lion gods that are out there. They would look just like them. It could be the Tengu, which are the bird Nephilim of the Southeast Asia. That would be from the Anunnaki, or bird-like god. Just as you have the Zabalba in the Popol Vuh, and the Camazotz, which is the house of the bat, which is a branch of the owl-like, bird-like Nephilim demigods. And if you Google Camazotz, you're going to get this picture of a suit that Batman wears in the superheroes, because these were the heroes of old, right?
Right, of course. Yeah.
Right, and most of them are all based on these ancient Nephilim and the technologies that were developed in the antediluvian world. Perhaps offspring of gods like Anubis, or Nebaz, as it shows up again as an Avian god in the east, who was the barking god. That the dog Nephilim and the dog warriors tend to come from. They're lower level within the sort of organizational structure, I think. So there's that aspect. It could mean that, or it could mean different kinds of Nephilim type of creations, right? From the offspring and of the gods, and maybe another animal, or a tripart aspect of human, animal, and gods. And the only reason why I leave open that sort of tripart aspect is when you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's talking about Gilgamesh after the flood, as opposed to Gilgamesh before the flood that shows up in the Book of Giants. He is 1/3. Pishtin is also listed the same way in Enkidu, and all of Utnapishtim's family. So for some reasons, the Sumerians were separating it into thirds instead of the typical sort of halves that we would understand it. So there could be another piece in there. I'm just speculating on that. Right. But if we understand that sort of concept, and you understand all of those other types of creatures that I was talking about, like the little people, that's kind of like under that greater Nephilim concept of other creatures that were developed either through DNA manipulation or sexual copulation, as they're typically understood as in mythology, or combination of it, right? So if you have Bigfoot as being a Nephilim associated, as they're showing up in the book of Jubilees, as we just mentioned, maybe that's a different sort of group of this Nephilim-like, but not the Nephilim, because they're clearly stated as a separate group of people. So you'd have to look for then a god, right? And understand that the Bigfoot aren't as big as the Nephilim.
Right.
Right. So they're either created through Nephilim copulating with an animal of some sort to sort of create it, even though Nephilim are also known as being hairy, and there's dark-haired ones. And Bigfoot is intelligent and it can communicate. We know these things, and it smells similar to a Nephilim according to it, and it's associated with portals, and there's an association here, but it's smaller and it's seemingly more distinct.
Right.
So again, an offspring of a Nephilim or a Rephaim and something, or a god and a human female, or a god and an animal or something. There is, though, this connection, if you want to get it closer to the Nephilim creation, there are gods in India and China that are ape gods, like Sun Wukong, or king in the Chinese version, and it was like the monkey king and the monkey demigods. India, which was an ape demigod. So I would look probably more to something closer related to that than the Nephilim doing it. Although it's possible, but Nephilim tend to have had procreation issues.
Okay.
So in the Ugaritic text, for example, they are bringing in rituals to Baal and Ashtaroth to come back because they've gone. Created the Rephaim, the Rapiu, as they're recorded in the Ugaritic text, then they, like their parent gods who also disappeared. In other words, Baal's father is El, and he's nowhere to be found, except that somehow you killed an immortal being, which doesn't make any sense. But what we do know is the angels and the gods who created Nephilim before the flood, they went to the abyss.
Yes.
Right? We know that in Jude 1:6. We know that in 2 Peter. And so if the offspring gods moved up as the Saba, as the host of heaven, as the rebellious ones, which means army, which has rank and order, and these are the sons of the parent gods who moved up, then if they did the same thing again after the flood, they would go to the abyss as well.
Wow.
Right? So they're trying to bring back Baal and Ashtaroth to recreate more Rephaim because they're having trouble reproducing.
Fantastic.
And they're talked about as having those issues.
Yeah.
So it seems unlikely, if they had those reproduction issues, that they would have been able to create this whole new race of Bigfoot or Sasquatch and all the different names that they're known on all continents around the world. And I think as well, when we look at that sort of interrelationship as to who the Bigfoot people are, is that they have and they're almost in a support role. They're also associated with little people and with caves and things like that. And they're associated with drinking the blood out of animals. They have a lot of different sort of traits, but they just seem to be, a little bit more distinct. They have shining eyes, as they're noted, just as the Nephilim were called shining ones. But the Nephilim were never described as apes, right? So I think the likelihood that they had procreation difficulties would lean that back, in my way of reckoning things, the offspring or the creation somehow that came from the fallen angels that created something that had DNA like them, either through DNA manipulation or sexual copulation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
And then and another one would be Dero is another god that sort of is as it comes out of mythology as one of those ape type of beings and associated with Bigfoot as well.
Dero?
Yeah, Dero.
Okay. I'll check that out too.
And that's linked to Ganesh of India. And Ganesh was an elephant god.
Yeah.
It's part of that pantheon of gods, right? Of animal-like beings.
Yes. Awesome. Mr. Wayne, thank you. I know there is so much more to go into, but I've already had you on here for over an hour and a half, and I know you're a busy, busy man. So maybe you can bless me with a part 2 one day down the road.
Oh, absolutely, because we just touched on things today. So.
I know. But I thank you so much for it. If you don't mind, why don't you tell everybody your websites, where they can find your book and all that good stuff?
Sure. If you want to get a hold of me, the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, which is the Genesis 6 with the number 6 conspiracy.com. And on that website, you have a contact the author. So, if you wanted, a document, let's say on the elementals that I was talking about today, or, how we know the sons of God are angels and not humans. I've got documents on that. I don't have documents on absolutely everything, but name the subject. And if I got a document, I'll send it to you. And if I don't have a document, I'll give you some information on it. Or if you have another question that you want to ask, just pose the question, and it may take me a couple of weeks to get back to you, but I will get back to you. Also on the website, you have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. So you can get a good feel for you whether or not it's the right book for you or not. And I think just looking at the table of contents is going to grab your attention. So, and if you didn't want to buy a book, you can link over to the Buy Now tab, and you can get a signed copy from me. Or you can link over to barnesandnoble.com or to amazon.com or to amazon.ca. and or to the Kindle version. So lots of ways to get that book off the website. It is available through most online bookstores. And it is, so if you prefer to buy not from the main ones, or if you wanted to support your local bookstore and it's not on their shelf, the publisher has it distributed through a company called Bookmasters in Pennsylvania. From there for you if you want to support your local bookstore.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It was worth the wait. And, I'll definitely be keeping in touch. Hopefully I can get this episode edited and all that kind of good stuff in the next couple of weeks and have it out before Easter.
Terrific.
But, I just want to thank you again. It's been an honor and a privilege to get to talk to you today.
Thank you. Invite me back anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.